Dr. Ramzy Baroud. Dr. Ramzy Baroud, who is a journalist, I would say, in addition, a world-renowned journalist, who many of us have been following for many years and now have the honor and opportunity to talk with him. He is the editor of the Palestine Chronicle, which I have been informed one can subscribe to, and now I intend to do that. So again, you'll see, I think you'll see a URL in the chat. He's the author of 5 books on Palestine, including My Father Was a Freedom Fighter, The Last Earth, and his latest, These Chains Will Be Broken, Palestinian Stories of Struggle and Defiance in Israeli Prisons. How apt, unfortunately, very apt. So welcome, Ramzy. We are honored to have you.
Thank you very much, Rep, for having me.
Sure. Awad Abdelfattah is the former Secretary General of the Democratic Assembly Party, known as Balad, and a former member of the Follow-Up Higher Committee, which is an umbrella organization encompassing leaders of the different Palestinian political parties and movements in Israel. Welcome, Awad. We're very, very honored to have you.
Thank you.
And Issam Adwan is the Gaza project manager for We Are Not Numbers. He's a trained translator and interpreter, as well as journalist and English teacher with more than 4 years of experience. In 2019, he was chosen by the Carter Center to be the first Palestinian independent observer for the Tunisian elections. His passions are improving the learning experience for diverse populations, youth empowerment, and social justice inequality. Welcome, Issam. Thank you for joining us. So, gentlemen, before we get into the subject matter, one of our committee members, Reverend Marcia Hoffman, who's a representative of the United Church of Christ in Southern California, Nevada Conference, and the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the Pacific Southwest region, will give us a land acknowledgement, because part of what we're talking about today is indigenous peoples and colonial settler movements. So we've got one right here in LA in the United States, and you've got one over there. So Marcia, please do our land acknowledgement. Whose land are we sitting on, Marcia?
Good morning, everyone. Along with being a member of JVP Los Angeles, I also work with various groups regarding reparations to our siblings, not just here, but around the globe. So it is essential, especially because, as Rick said, of the work we do for Palestinian human and land rights, that we remember whose land we move on and reside on here in this area. We can't fight against one pillar of oppression, Israeli occupation and apartheid rule over the Palestinian people, while ignoring the other pillars of oppression. In particular, the violence that the indigenous peoples of this land have experienced and continue to experience. Because we're based in Los Angeles, I'm going to speak specifically to the indigenous people of this area. For folks who are interested and may not know the indigenous stewards of the land you live on, there's a website, hopefully it's going to go in the chat, where you can research this. I think if you just Google native-land.cal or whatever state you're in, or put in the town and state you live in information, you will find it. As Jewish Voice for Peace in Los Angeles, we honor the Gabrielino, Tongva, Kitsk, Fernanya, Tata, Viam, and the Torino, Chumash peoples who have been the land's stewards, modeling a long tradition of resistance and seeking liberation. So I now send it back to Rick. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcia. And by the way, for those who might not know, United Church of Christ has tens of thousands, I believe, of members. There are, correct me if I'm wrong, Marcia, but I think there are like 1,800 churches around the United States, and is related to what sort of came out of the Congregational Church, which has presidents of the United States who were members going back to George Washington's time.
Right. Well, and some we have also we're relationships with other countries too.
Yeah, and they have an amazing program about Palestine. So when it comes to a rising consciousness in the United States, which we could talk about later, of awareness of Palestinians' rights and predicament under the Israeli rule, there's a lot to be pleased about. Okay, I digress.
Thank you, Rick.
Yeah, it's very encouraging, and of course, we're really happy to have a diverse committee in Jewish Voice for Peace here in Los Angeles, of which Marcia is a terrific part. And by the way, the organization of this whole hour and a half discussion was very much precipitated by the contribution of our member, Jeff Cooper, who used to teach in the Quaker school in Ramallah during the first Intifada, and was very much the inspiration for having this conversation. So let me start by asking each of you, oh, I forgot one thing. I also want to introduce Professor Dr. Mahmoud Ibrahim, who is our local scholar on things Palestinian and beyond. I believe Islamic studies is included at Cal State. Remind me, Mahmoud, Cal State, Pomona, yes? Where he's been teaching history for a long time, even though he's muted. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you, Mahmoud. Can you unmute him?
Yeah, so Pomona, Cal Poly Pomona. Is that
Yeah.
what you're about? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so glad you could join us, Mahmoud. Anyway, here's the question for our three main guests, and that is, could you tell us your personal impressions of what are the dynamics, new and old, of this current Palestinian resistance that we've just witnessed? You can talk about what precipitated, if you want, in terms of the Netanyahu provocations, whether it's Al-Aqsa or in the streets. We'd like each of your interpretation of what are the root dynamics of this. And Ramzy, I'll start with you. Could you give us your impressions?
Thank you very much, Rick, and thank you to all of you, Jeff, Reverend Hoffman, Dr. Ibrahim, Benjamin, the technical team, and everyone else who helped us and gave us this platform to reach out to your wonderful listeners out there. I think we have to acknowledge that there has been an ongoing dilemma as far as the Palestinian people are concerned. Now, we speak of the Israeli occupation, Israeli colonialism, Israeli apartheid, racism, imperialism, and such, and so forth. But one thing we don't usually speak of is the fact that Palestinians are at the cusp of a political and historical transition that doesn't just allow them to confront and deal with the Israeli occupation, which they have done nonstop for decades, but also within the corruption within own ranks. And here I am talking about this Vichy government of Palestine, the Palestinian Authority, and Mahmoud Abbas. Now, what the Oslo Accord has done is that we usually discuss Oslo and the peace process in terms of American priorities. What worked, what didn't. Obama was a bit more persuasive. He tried to put pressure on Israel, supposedly Trump was more pro-Israel than any other president in history, and so forth. As if the question of the peace process, or so-called peace process, or the question of Oslo is an exclusive American-Israeli question, with Netanyahu playing along, or Bennett agreeing to engage or not with the Palestinian Authority. But there is a Palestinian question involved in all of this. And that is the fact that the Oslo peace process has in fact divided the Palestinian people. So when we speak about unity, and I believe that this is the theme of the conference, then we also speak of disunity. What disunited us as a people? Now, let me just go back briefly and acknowledge that there is no such thing in the history of a national liberation movement anywhere, between starting from Vietnam to Algeria, prior to that, to Libya, to even Cuba, to South Africa, and so forth. There has never been a national liberation movement that was truly united in the actual meaning of the word. Unity here has to carry an alternative meaning. It has to be redefined in order for Palestinians not to be singled out as if they are an anomaly in anti-colonial liberation movements. And I think quite often we use the word unity and disunity in a disingenuous sort of way, as if we are trying to say that Palestinians are different. In fact, Netanyahu has been very clear throughout the years when he said, we don't have a peace partner because Palestinians are not united. They don't speak in one voice, and so forth. And as a result, everybody has been putting this pressure on the Palestinians, from the European Union to the Americans to other entities. Palestinians, you have to unite. So let's Hamas and Fatah go and talk in Istanbul and in Sana'a, Yemen, and in Saudi Arabia and in Egypt over and over again to talk about unity, because Palestinians are different and they have to be united. I've made an argument for many years that this is not the kind of unity we are looking for. We're not looking for factional unity. We could care less if Hamas and Fatah managed to share the political leverages and privileges that come out from this kind of unity. Whether they form a government or they don't form a government, it actually have very little repercussions on the Palestinian people. The kind of unity we are looking for is a Palestinian people who are united in their political and national aspirations for a single goal. And this is the unity we have been fishing for, we have been waiting for, we have been searching for in every possible way. And May 2021 was that historic moment in which the Palestinian people have declared, separate from factions, separate from political dialogue, separate from European Union pressures, they have, through blood, sacrifice, resistance, popular resistance and armed resistance in Gaza, the hundreds of thousands of people who rushed to the streets of Palestine 48, to East Jerusalem, to the West Bank and throughout Gaza, the millions of people who rose as one, despite of their religious differences, despite of their class differences, despite of their political and ideological differences. That is the kind of unity we have been waiting for decades, and we have achieved it. And I've wrote extensively about this subject. In fact, some people compared it to the 1987 Palestinian uprising, and I said no, actually the closest is in fact the 1936 Palestinian uprising, because never before has the Palestinian people everywhere within occupied Palestine and historic Palestine actually stood together as one. Now the question is, and I believe that much of the discussion and it is going to focus on this. I know Awad and Issam have so much to say about this, is how do we galvanize on this historic rebellion, and how do we build on this grassroots movements in Palestine, but also internationally, in order for us to break away from the factional domination over the Palestinian cause and to liberate the Palestinian discourse from American diktats and Israeli pressures and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ramzy. That's a wonderful leading off comprehensive view. It's just what we're looking for. And before I go any further to introduce, to ask the same question of the two other guests, I just want people to note, in this case, fellow Americans who are the majority of our viewers, have you heard any of this anywhere? Anywhere in the American media? I mean, I haven't. I admit, I stopped watching the news. I even let go of the New York Times. But I mean, I just don't think, I think it's blocked. I do think that we have such an unconscious colonial view, even those of us who are anti-colonial carry it around, because we just don't get the information to process. Thank you again, Ramzy. And Awad, could you please give us your, feel free to also comment on Ramzy's comments, but we'd like your perspective, how you experienced it and what you think of this moment in time in the Palestinian resistance and in the history of the Palestinian people.
Thank you very much for organizing this webinar. And hi to everybody, to the viewers, to the listeners. And thank you, dear Ramzy, for the important introduction, presentation that you have just given. Yeah, I mean, no doubt that the latest round of resistance is a juncture in the history of the struggle of the Palestinian people. And I myself was very close to what has been happening in Palestine, starting from the first Intifada, where I worked as a journalist in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, although I'm an Israeli citizen, as a journalist and as an activist, in fact. And I was very close there, I was involved there. And I could see how things evolved and how also the trajectory of the Intifada ended. And also the second Intifada, which was completely different, was inclusive, was armed and violent and non-violent. And the latest one, which came against all odds, I mean, came all of it as a surprise for everybody. I think even for Palestinians. This latest round of resistance, in fact, I wasn't involved on the national level. I'm talking as a secretary general of the party, and as an organizer, I used to be active in the field. In fact, I used to organize young activists to go to the streets and be with them. In the latest round of resistance, I was involved only on my local village. I mean, my own village, because I quit from the leadership of the party and from the leadership of the follow-up committee 4 years ago. Now act as an independent activist, in fact, and a coordinator of the One Democratic State campaign. But I was involved in the demonstrations that took place in my village. And I could see, although I live in a tiny village, a small village in the middle of Israeli settlements, but people, the teenagers were the main force. And this was a surprise to me. Though I am active, I know the people. Of course, there are young activists who led the demonstrations, but I really engaged with them. I tried to guide them, to direct them, to show that. But the response was fierce by the Israelis, though it was peaceful. What surprised us, or what surprised the Israelis, and I think everybody, is that the degree of fragmentation that the Palestinians have experienced, or the fragmentation that has been forced upon the Palestinian people by the Israeli apartheid regime. Because Israel have employed this policy, I mean, to fragment the Palestinian people in order to control them and to separate people from the different geographies where they live. And for us Palestinians inside the Green Lines, Israel has been working tirelessly since 1948 to separate us from the rest of the Palestinian people, to sever our cultural roots, to submerge our Palestinian identity, and to create an identity that is like a hybrid, distorted, that they needed us to be loyal to the state of Israel while continue to take over our lands, to colonize us, and also to kill our people. So this is a dilemma that we have been living since 1948. But I can say that most Palestinians inside the Green Line, in fact, have survived this policy. Like part of us survived the ethnic cleansing that was carried in 1948, because I myself am one of the descendants of those who survived the ethnic cleansing that was carried in 1948. So that was amazing, that despite the fragmentation, despite the despair that Israel has been trying to create by cracking down on activists, by legislating racist laws, by carrying out suppressive administrative orders, by striking deals with Arab regimes. So all these, I can say the environment, the regional, the international environment, the local environment was discouraging. And some people would think that to expect is an uprising in such circumstances is a fantasy. And this happened. I tell myself, I have held the view that two trajectories have been going on outside the traditional structure of the Palestinian leadership. So the first is that there relates to the intellectual level, that academics, intellectuals have been writing, have been talking about colonial perspective. You know, when Palestinian leadership abandoned the anti-colonial struggle and started to relate to the conflict as if it is between two states. One is Israel and the other, which is the Palestinian state, which is a virtual phantom state. And when intellectuals and academics started to regain this perspective, that was very important. I mean, this is educative for Palestinians, because some think that this is new. This is not new, because early Palestinian scholars had written about that, like Fayez Sayegh, for example, who wrote in the late 60s about comparison between South Africa and Israel. I mean, there were people who spoke about that. Azmi Bishara, in the 90s, he wrote about apartheid, that Israel was apartheid state. But this came after Oslo, because Oslo wanted to end the anti-colonial struggle and to reduce it to a statehood, and that's all. So what distinguished this uprising is that two things. No, before I talk about what distinguished it, is that about the other thing, or the other trajectory that has been underway, is that I believe, and I've always believed that the Palestinian National Project is being built from below. And this process has been going since over the last 20 years. That academics, intellectuals, the young activists, committees for the return of the refugees, mobilizations, resistance or committees against the resisting the wall, the separation wall. All these groups and individuals have been in the field. And in fact, they are rebuilding the Palestinian National Project, which had been abandoned by the Palestinian leadership to reconstruct the Palestinian national leadership outside the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. So this is the most important. And we saw this in this uprising, that the driving force of this uprising was a young activist. It was they who started it in Sheikh Jarrah, in Damascus Gate, in Bab al-Amud, and then went to the Palestinians inside the Green Line, then moved to Gaza. The Israelis, in an attempt to distort the nature of this uprising and to incite against Palestinians inside the Green Line, it was saying that the Palestinians responded to the call of Hamas to go to the streets, which is untrue, because Palestinians started the demonstrations before Hamas joined the struggle, before it started firing rockets. It started in Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, it was really the initiator of previous mobilizations. Over 5 or 6 years, there have been mobilizations in Jerusalem. The young activists there became more mature, more knowledgeable, and more experienced. So Palestinians, of course, interact inside the Green and interacted in the uprising in Jerusalem, because they have been visiting the Al-Aqsa and sitting in there. You know, it was their role was crucial. And this is why the slogan or the hashtag Palestine from the river to the sea, or the unity of, and there have been several names for this intifada. And this is one of the most important. I can say that despite the fact that this uprising was short in time, but it was profound, its implications are still going on. And it's right that we don't see now the confrontational, inclusive, or comprehensive confrontations, but the intifada, the seeds of the intifada, the implications are still there. We can build on that. What is lacking today is lacking, of course, that the young activists who have been leading these mobilizations are not yet united, around one vision. What do we want at the end? So how can we, because Ramzy ended his presentation by posing this a challenge. Really, this is a challenge. This is why I'd say to the young activists that the challenge, this is a major challenge. How can we build on what we have been doing? The Palestinian people, or the grassroots movements that have been active and creating a new era of struggle. So we need a united vision. We want to go to the world, or first of all, to appeal to the Palestinian people that we are united. There is a leadership, a new leadership. Since the traditional leadership is incompetent, is corrupt, is not doing what is needed, because the Palestinians prove that they can unite, they can struggle, and there is point in the struggle, they can achieve successes. It's right that this uprising has not ended the occupation, it has not ended the siege, it has not even removed any checkpoint in the West Bank and Gaza, but it has removed the psychological barrier between the Palestinians themselves. It has united them. Today there is a new consciousness. I think that a new Palestinian is born, and this Palestinian represents the future of the struggle. So this is why the state of Israel its response to the Intifada, especially to the resistance that occurred inside the Green Line, was very fierce. They imported border guards. They imported settlers from West Bank, Gaza, to crack down on Palestinians who are citizens of the state of Israel, to attack them in the streets, to attack their houses, their shops. And even Netanyahu said that what is happening inside the Green Line among Palestinians who are citizens of the state of Israel is more dangerous than the Iranian nuclear bomb. And this was said before by another minister some 10, 15 years ago, because they had always thought that the Palestinians have been tamed, that they could co-opt them and corrupt or convince them with civil rights, with small civil rights, and force them to forget about their national identity, about their belonging to the Palestinian people. I believe that Palestinians inside them have proved again, I'm not surprised, and I've written several times, that the Palestinians inside the Green Line can play a crucial role in the struggle against apartheid and settler colonialism. And they can also propose a democratic solution to the conflict that is the one democratic state of Palestine. This is, I think, the vision, I believe, that should be presented to the Palestinian, to the world, to the Israelis, and to us. But we, this is another issue that we Palestinians are not, they have not agreed, are not agreed on this point. But what they have agreed is that Palestine is one geography, one demography, and one faith.
Beautiful, Awad. Thank you so much. You've been very patient, Issam, and you've got a lot of stimulation from the last two speakers to push you forward, but we're very anxious to hear what things looked like in the past few months of this resistance, how they look to you. So please tell us, what is your perspective on this issue?
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. It's actually an honor to learn again from Dr. Ramzy, from friend Awad. This is a great work, and I hope we can do more to raise awareness about the Palestinian struggle. I don't know if I have so much space to add, but I would like to add a couple of things that I have in mind. First, and it's one of the most essential parts that I'm always adding, is that how can you help? Let's say first, how much do you know about the Palestinian struggle? How much you are misinformed to understand us? So starting with the belief that I have lived my 28 years of life being under this dark occupation, and for the past 16 years, I've been literally caged in the area, so-called area, Gaza Strip, but it's actually a big prison that I was denied 99% of my rights, and still, it is still going. So the Nakba is not only relevant or stated by the date 1948, it is still going, and I am, as a person, I am one of the results of this ongoing Nakba. So starting with the belief of the work We Are Not Numbers, that there are no people who are voiceless, but people who are deliberately silenced or preferably unheard. We are trying to amplify the voices of Palestinian stories, that to see them, in order to understand their suffering, you have to see them as people first. And this what hasn't happened for the past, let's say, of more than 70 years. We have been isolated from you. You have been misinformed about our struggle. You don't know the human stories behind those numbers in the news. The only pictures you see us are two pictures: either we are terrorists or we are victims. And yes, we are the latter, but of course we are people for those two things that you should know about. We are people trying to live in peace and with dignity, and this hasn't happened since 1948, and it's still going on. So in order to understand the suffering of the Palestinian people, you have to see them as people first. You have to bridge those gaps of culture, of language, of politics. I know politics is really a dilemma to be understood, even to Palestinians themselves, but we are also trying to learn your language, to learn your culture, to approach you with any way to tell you those stories. And this is actually one of the attempts of We Are Not Numbers, along with several organizations on a local level and on an international level. The second point that I would like to highlight is what can you do to help Palestinians first? And the most important part, you have to see them as people first. And this is very important, because if you don't see them as people, trust me, you will just get over the line on the news that numbers of people died, numbers of people injured, numbers of houses bombed. You will just forget about us afterwards. But if you see them as people first, Issam living in Gaza for the past 28 years of his life, and the rest goes on. Actually, it's not about my story, it's about the story of the people. You have to understand them as people first. You have to share their stories, because those stories are coming out of suffering, out of pain, out of death, to be more specific. We're trying to amplify the stories of death. Yes, that's true. But also we're trying to amplify the voices of hope, the voices of love, of music, which you rarely, and I would say, which you never heard about in Fox News or by any American journalists. You will find them out throughout a Palestinian, speaker, journalist. And that is what I'm trying to amplify here. The third part, which is very essential as well, is that you have to acknowledge, either you like it or not, either you are aware of it or not, that you are part of the problem. Your governments are part of the problem. They have been funding this from the very beginning. They have been supporting this from the very beginning. So what costs could the Palestinians could pay more to educate the world and to let them know that those leaders are part of the issue, especially the US administration, the United Kingdom administration. They have been contributing to this suffering and to this ongoing Nakba from the very beginning. So realizing that you're part of the issue raises your responsibility, that you are also part of the solution. You are one of the keys of these solutions, through amplifying the voices of youth, through amplifying the honest and the facts of those stories of Palestinians. Then you are part of the solution, as you hope for. The third thing that I wanted to highlight, what makes this uprising different than the ones before? First, you are facing a generation that speaks your language very well. And second, we are using an outlet that the propaganda cannot control, which is the social media. And this is what we have been noticing for the past, let's say, a year and a half, and especially the last 11 days of attacks on Gaza. We have witnessed a great shift. And I'm really glad that this shift has happened finally, after those heavy prices we're paying with our newborn babies, with our women, with our fathers, brothers and sisters. After those heavy prices that we have been paying for the past 70 years, finally you started to listen to our stories. And of course, with the use of social media, which propaganda barely can control, of course, we're being censored, we're being banned on social media platforms, but still the story is spread, and of course, with your help, that those stories are heard finally. So what makes it different? You're facing a generation that understands your language. And the second part, we are attempting to get the unity we are calling for, and not only for the unity of Palestinians, but also the unity of those facing injustice all over the world, because the problem of Palestinians is not only Palestinians. The problem of Palestinians is not only Israel, and it's not only about Palestine. It's about injustice that is not acceptable wherever it happens. It happens under the administration of the United States. It happens everywhere. Every country in the Middle East is at some point being dominated in some sense. We're being occupied, we're being consumed at so many levels, including Palestine. So realizing that it goes beyond Palestine is one of the keys of understanding Palestinians, is one of the keys of understanding that in order to help the Palestinians, you have to help others. And in order for Palestinians to liberate themselves, they have also have a duty to understand others, like what goes on with the Black Lives Matter in the US. So solidarity, support, unity, which we are seeking at this moment, is one of the keys that we are trying to work on, and to dig more solutions and in new ways, new creative ways of how we can amplify the voices of those facing injustice wherever they are. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, that's just terrific, Issam. I'm almost speechless, which is a very rare occurrence for me. Mahmoud, you've been listening to this. A lot of the people on this call, because it's Jewish Voice for Peace, it's not exclusively, there's Democratic Socialists of America here, there's Code Pink people here, there's various, but in our background, we're part of what the Israelis call a diaspora. We've even called it ourselves. I don't find it that way. I think all my ancestors were people who did not have a nation state and had a rich culture and a rich life nonetheless. But Mahmoud, you're part of the Palestinian so-called diaspora. And both as a Palestinian refugee and as a scholar of the Islamic world and of Palestine, do you have any particular questions for our three guests based on what they've already said? Is there something, direction that you'd like to take in this conversation, like to direct us to?
Thank you very much, Rick, and thanks everybody for being here and speaking about the issue. Of course, I'm listening and learning a lot, and also getting a lot of recollections that give me a sort of a context and a hope for the future. So there's a lot of issues that were raised. Let me say, when I was chair of the history department at Birzeit University when the first Intifada broke out, and eventually I came to do a project, secret project, and that is to interview the young activist kids who were like 15, 16, 17, 18 from all over the West Bank. And so it is actually the youth who were really driving the first Intifada. And, we walked in the streets and I taped their conversations, and I have, collections of all of this. Eventually came out to as a book called The Oral History of the Intifada. And so that's the youth that everybody's talking about. And that is the youth that is bringing out the new realities. Because as the first Intifada, and even in the second Intifada, and this one too, if we want to call this a third Intifada, is that it is the people rather than the leadership. And again, here I want to bring it back to the leadership, which has been actually, it seems as far as we're concerned from the outside, is in cahoots with the Israeli authorities, this kind of arrangements, security arrangements, for example. Security arrangements against who? And so that's the kind of issues that I begin to think of. And so my question is, are the youth, again, is still leading this? And of course, I've seen it in, Sheikh Jarrah and Bab al-Amud and in the Aqsa and in Gaza. I've seen it everywhere. And how can we, continue on this kinds of mobilization to get the youth to really engender new realities, because they have a different vocabulary now. I don't have Twitter, but there's a lot of these kind of social media. So encouraging the youth is one thing that I really see that. But in terms of the leadership, how can we get rid of this particular leadership when they really continue to postpone elections or cancel elections, and somehow we are still stuck with Mahmoud Abbas and others like him who use the office to basically stay in the office and not do anything. And I also was reminded in many conversations with Al-Haq, Law in the Service of Man in Ramallah, is that as Palestinians who are living in Jordan, living in the West Bank, living in Israel, living in Beirut, Lebanon, and many other places, we have different kinds of experiences that we went through after the Nakba, after 1948. And so one of our projects that we wanted to get going is how can we create this national consciousness amongst different groups that have gone through different experiences. We are all Palestinians, but we have different experiences from these different places. And so going back now to the current situations, it seems that what we have been witnessing is again, this kind of unity that comes about without somebody is, pulling the strings. It came about, and exactly it's because of the experiences of the Palestinian people. So there's a couple of things that I really would like to have addressed to explain this. Is one thing, for example, is the issue of the settler mentality within 1948 boundaries. That is, specifically in Lid, for example, the movement to displace Palestinians within these cities, which contributed to the unity, and people begin to see, hey, there's ethnic cleansing going on in Sheikh Jarrah, there is ethnic cleansing going on in Lid. And so that is very easily can bring these people to consciousness. So I'd like to address that issue as far as how the Palestinians continue to be under attack, colonialist attack, inside and outside. The second thing, and I think I would imagine would tie this in, is an article I read by Ramzy about Jenin. Of course, we all remember Jenin in the second uprising. It was destroyed, demolished over its inhabitants. I'm talking about the refugee camps. And apparently in May, there is something going on in this refugee camp that goes back to this issue of unity. So I'd like, if these issues can be brought about, and maybe we clarify our steps to the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahmoud. And that is the questions you just brought up certainly deserve a thorough discussion, but given the limitations of our time, I want to make the challenge even more difficult for our guests. Hope you'll forgive me. But while you're addressing that, also I'd like to sprinkle some spice on top of it in the form of telling you, which you may or may not know, a couple things. One is that there is a very important shift going on in the United States, in particular in the Jewish community, on Palestine, Israel. There was a poll out from, I believe it was Shibli Telhami from University of Maryland, very legitimate poll that said that 25% of American Jews subscribe to the belief that Israel is an apartheid state. It's absolutely shocking in the Jewish community here, where all official Jewish community institutions are Zionist controlled. Secondly, 22% of American Jews actually would subscribe to the description of Israel engaging in genocide. Unbelievable. And in Congress, there are more co-sponsors now for limiting aid to Israel. This sort of phenomena is changing, even though Joe Biden, one of the most Republican of Democrats in history, hasn't moved an inch on this thing, except perhaps when confronted by the lone Palestinian member of Congress, Rashida Tlaib, at the airport in Detroit. Somehow she got in front of him and perhaps had some influence on him, perhaps making pressure on Bibi Netanyahu to shorten the massacre. Okay, I know that I don't want to cover up what Mahmoud has just said, so I'm counting on you to be able to hold both things in your mind, because I think this will be the last go round before we open it up to general questions. Ramzy, do you want to kick it off?
Absolutely, and thank you, Professor Ibrahim, for this excellent description of really the kind of the deep challenges that we rarely address, but they deserve to be addressed and discussed. I'm going to try to answer quite briefly some of these points. So I feel like I touched on everything, but definitely without elaboration, since it's a very elaborate topic to begin with. I remember back during the American, the early months of the American invasion of Iraq. Actually, let me paraphrase that. It was just before the American invasion of Iraq. Noam Chomsky was asked a question, I think it was on Democracy Now!, and he was asked the following question, more or less. What should Americans do to stop the war? And he kind of didn't really answer the question. He addressed it in a different way. He said, you know, in other parts of the world, people do not ask, what can we do? They just do it. In India, they just do it. In Palestine, they just do it. And this is why I think sometimes what Antonio Gramsci refers to as intellectualism, which is the kind of talking about talking and in a way that is isolated from what's actually happening in the street. I actually think that political consciousness amongst all Palestinians exists at some level. Yes, I am not denying that there are indeed geopolitical factors and class factors. There are very wealthy Palestinians who want to protect their wealth. And there are poor Palestinians in Geneva refugee camp who have nothing to lose. And there are prisoners who are digging their ways out of prisons with a rusty spoon, and there are people, you know, flashing their VIP cards wherever they go in their black limousines. And I'm not going to pretend that they are all subscribing to the same political consciousness, but the fact that when the Palestinians were called upon by Sheikh Jarrah at a particular time in history, all Palestinians, well, the vast majority of them, not just in Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem and in Palestine 48, but also throughout the region, people like me, people in California like you, Professor Ibrahim, we all went out there and our millions of people protested from Morocco to Santiago, Chile, to Amman, Jordan, to London, UK. Despite of the numerous differences that we may have, and despite the fact that our positions and our positionality within these various geopolitical and geographic atmospheres may be different, but we found a common ground somehow. And that's the beauty of a popular rebellion. That's the beauty of the genuine and organic grassroots movements, because they appeal to our collective consciousness. I'm not terribly worried about the political consciousness of Palestinians everywhere. In my previous books, most of my books have focused on the issue of people's history, not because I am just really interested in sentimentalities, but it's my way of proving that despite of the passing of time, Palestinians still, regardless of where they are in the world, they still hang on a single ideal that makes them unique as a collective and make them subscribe to a single political consciousness, despite of the numerous differences that we may have at other levels, including economic and geographic and elsewhere. And I'm going to tie this to a question that was asked by someone in the audience. And I'm sorry that I did not keep track of the name. She asked a very legitimate question. She said, so what you say that Palestinians are united at a different level, not factional, not necessarily ideological. What is that unity and how do you describe that unity? And I'm going to tie it into the question by Professor Ibrahim, is the idea that Palestinian unity is the idea that whether Awad is based in Palestine 48, or Issam is based in Gaza, or Ramzy is based in Seattle, and Ibrahim is based in California, is that we are fighting for one common cause. And that cause, we are fighting against Israeli apartheid, racism, occupation, and imperialism. That's the first thing. Recognizing who we are, recognizing our various unique positions, I understand, but also recognizing the nature of our fight against our enemy. Number two, that we must resist. We may disagree on the form of resistance, and that's fine, and that's completely legitimate. And again, every national liberation movement had that disagreement, and many of them never resolved this disagreement until the very end. We will disagree, but we must agree that we must resist. Al-Muqawama is and should always be part and parcel of our thinking. This is not Mahmoud Abbas going to the United Nations and giving some fiery speech and then going back to the West Bank to coordinate with the very Israeli enemy and the Israeli military to coordinate the capture of Palestinian prisoners. It doesn't work that way. Resistance is resistance, and we have to resist, and we have to agree on this as a step to move forward. We have to reject Oslo and the culture of Oslo that has divided our people into poor and rich, VIP card holders and people who are starving and struggling to make ends meet on a daily basis. We have to find these common grounds, and I believe in my heart and in my mind and various evidence on the ground subscribe to the fact that in fact we are achieving that unity. A friend of ours, Professor Ilan Pape, described to me a few weeks ago, he said when he went to one of the protests in Haifa of the Palestinian population in Haifa protesting against the Israeli war on Gaza and the violations of human rights and ethnic cleansing of Sheikh Jarrah. And he said, kind of to test the atmosphere, he said, I kept asking young people, I kept asking them, are you with Hamas or with Fatah or with the Jabha Sha'biya, you know, the popular fronts? And he said, every single one of them was almost angry in his response. Like, how dare you would even ask such a question? You know, we are Palestinians, and that is, in my mind, that is Palestinian unity. And this is what we should aspire to achieve. I've taken more than my fair share. Just want to make one last comment, Professor Ibrahim, about Jenin. I have written a book with the help of Professor Noam Chomsky a long time ago called Searching Jenin, and it was the story of the Israeli war and massacre in Jenin in 2002. And now I find myself going through the book, finding some of the characters that are now somehow related to what is happening in Jenin at the moment. There is an armed rebellion building up in Jenin. Zakaria Zubaydi, one of the 6 prisoners who escaped from the Israeli prison a few weeks ago, comes from Jenin. I feel that Jenin is going to be the heart of a new form of resistance that is happening in the West Bank. And I've been made that argument repeatedly in the past, and I feel like history is validating that argument at this point. There is a clear demarcation that is taking place in the West Bank. Those who are aligned with Mahmoud Abbas and his corrupt clique of wealthy Palestinians, and those who are finding ways to get back to the street and resume the struggle. This is not a promotion of armed struggle versus any other form of struggle. It is just the idea that Palestinians in the West Bank are fed up and they are ready to challenge not just the Israeli occupation, but the corrupt elites amongst them.
Thank you, Ramzy. Awad, you're up. Your reaction to that, or whatever else you want to bring up, because you know, there's so much on the plate. I don't know how many times we'll get back to you. So if anything else is on your mind that you want to contribute in addition to responding to Professor Ibrahim.
Yeah, Ramzy, in fact, said almost everything about that, because the main challenge really now is how to go ahead, how to overcome the obstacles that stand before the young generation. No doubt that that division within the Palestinian national movement is the major obstacle. The cooperation with the colonizer is a major obstacle. So, but as I said before, that despite these obstacles, the Palestinian people went to the streets and continued to resist. And the groups, the initiatives, as I said before, continue to resist and to try to capitalize on what have been happening in the last few months. I have been involved in debate side the Green Line and in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. A month ago, we had 2 meetings in Ramallah. We were thinking, how can we accelerate the unity of these groups and initiatives, because there has been networking by these groups. There is, but the problem is that they still don't have yet a united umbrella, a political vision that unites them or united strategy. But this doesn't underestimate or downplay the importance of what has been doing. I think that things are evolving, and at certain point, what I am talking about is going to happen, that these groups will finally find the way and will build the umbrella, the political umbrella. But what we aspire, in fact, is that to shorten the way, is that to save the time, to save, because, and also to try to obstruct or to prevent the Palestinian Authority and other traditional groups, to prevent this trajectory from evolving quickly. And also the Israelis, of course, have been working, and they are racing against time. They want to kill the seeds of the uprising. And the international and the regional players, they rushed to intervene and to stop the uprising, not because they care about Palestinians, but simply because this would destabilize their or hurt their interests. The Palestinian cause today is not an issue, a humanitarian issue for the world. It's for the international community. It's a burden for them. They wanted just to submerge it. They don't care about solving it. They wanted to go to the so-called peace process in order to keep the process itself as a process, as an end itself. They don't want to solve it. But what is now happening is that there is an upheaval. And you talked about the shift of opinion in the United States. We are very pleased about that. The young generation is very aware about what's happening in the United States and the world. And this is part of the struggle of the Palestinian people. Yeah, justice. Today, going back to intersectional activism is very important. The Palestinian cause, from the very beginning, not only today, was a product of the capitalist regime, was a product of the imperialist world. It was born by the interior forces. And still, this capitalist regime, this imperialist regime, which created the Palestinian problem, is still alive and kicking. And this is why Palestinians should connect with the freedom fighters around the world, should follow up with what is happening in the United States and Europe. That is but because these groups are going back to intersectionality. So there is no way of solving the Palestinian problem without decolonizing the entire region and the entire world. This doesn't mean that we have to wait until the world is decolonized, but we think that the Palestinian people, can really serve as a spearhead of this struggle if the struggle is organized better. And this is what we are trying to do. We don't know when can we achieve that, but there is one fact, is that there is no return. There is no point of return. That Palestinians are today, I believe, that despite all what the Israelis are doing now, and what the Palestinian Authority is doing, and what the international community is doing too, that the Palestinians are fully aware that they are one people, and what is needed now is how to translate this into an action plan, a united action plan.
Thank you, Awad. Thank you very much. Issam, if you will excuse me for a second, I need to point out in the chat, there's a very important piece of information. If everybody backs up a little bit to about the time on this entry in the chat is 11:06 a.m. here. I'll just quickly read it. Several members of the U.S. House of Representatives are working to block $735 million in extra weapons, like they don't have enough, recently approved to be sent to Israel. Write your member of Congress here, and it's got the URL. I really want to ask everybody to take the trouble and go back, find that, and execute it. because if we're going to be responsible, the least we could do is a website. I mean, we don't have to get hit over the head, luckily. So, you know, please go back and look at 11:06 a.m. to find that, and let your House of Representatives person know that not only is the Israel lobby looking at them, we're looking at them. Let them know. And Marcy Winograd and Dennis, thank you for putting that in there, Dennis Courtoyer. Marcy Winograd added, yes, I think AOC is leading that congressional effort. Good for her. Thank you, Marcy. Marcy asks, are there any emerging Palestinian leaders to effectively challenge the corrupt PA elites? I'm sure you will all answer in one way or the other in the affirmative. It'll be interesting to hear what your answers are. And just one other thing before I hand it back over to Issam. We want to wish everybody a happy new year. We just had Jewish New Year, and I went to my first Yom Kippur service in about 10 years. I thought that I was done for life, but they pulled me in as a choir member. So I was sitting there, and I just got to tell you this, that, you know, we went through a couple hours of atoning for our sins almost without mentioning Palestine. Luckily, I was in a feminist service. They did mention Palestine and then didn't atone for anything. It's like, I can't, it's like living in outer space, you know, when spirituality is devoid of real content and humanity. Forgive my personal interjection there, but back to the questions that Professor Ibrahim raised, and also Issam, since we're getting to the end, some of the local experience in Gaza, perhaps, of how people in general and yourself, you know, experience this round of resistance and Israeli destruction. So whatever you'd like to say on all those many topics, I hope I'm not overloading you.
Yeah, of course. I believe I can see more than what Dr. Ramzy added and friend Awad added, but I would like to answer one of the questions. It's also one of the reflections to the answer for Professor Mahmoud. Does not violence lead to more violence? Would not be a method of Gandhi be worth trying? So to answer this question, let's get back a little bit to 2018 during the Great March of Freedom, in which I personally protested peacefully, bare, you know, souls and bodies, along with hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from Gaza to the Israeli, to the borders, which is pretty illegal borders between Gaza Strip and the eastern borders of Gaza, between Gaza and Israel. And we protested peacefully, following the leads of Gandhi, trying to read some books and, you know, celebrate some of the Palestinian chanting songs and cooking food and doing, you know, life activities as we used to back in 1948. And what we have been faced with is live ammunition, explosive bullets, tear gas, which led to hundreds of people losing their upper limbs, and hundreds of people died during the protest, and hundreds of people were injured. And those people lived catastrophic situations just for demanding a legal right, which, as stipulated by the United Nations General Assembly number 194, which is the right of return, as we are always calling for. So in order to understand what the Palestinians are doing, and in order to be able to understand that you shouldn't conduct any form of resistance before forcing people to specific kinds of resistance, you have first to allow them to express their ways of anger towards this ongoing genocide. You can't actually dare to blame people who are suffering, who are witnessing, especially the people of Gaza, who lived this 15 years of imprisonment with an absolute policy to suffocate every norms of a human being's existence. And then you come with a question that, okay, violence and shooting rockets are not allowed. So start debating about the blockade in the first place. Start talking about this inhumane policy of people dying, witnessing their children starving, and they couldn't even find food and water to bring to them, and they don't have jobs. The majority of my generation, unfortunately, more than 90% of my generation, they do not have jobs. And more importantly, they do not have hope. We are facing, of course, one of the main obstacles, which is the corruption of the PA and the lack of elections for the past 16 years. And of course, there are emerging leaders among those youth, but we are not aware of them. We have not had any chance to elect people to lead us. So in order to understand this political gap, this human rights gap of the Palestinian struggle, you have to bridge those gaps through understanding the human stories behind those people. It's just you have to look at them as people first, and you have to understand them as people first. So yes, I may disagree with using violence as a Palestinian. I may disagree with that, but I have absolutely no right to deny people any form of resistance to express this inhumane death they are facing. And to be specific on the experience of Gaza, we are living an equation that we are either remaining silent and die in silence and die slowly, as what happened in the past 16 years, or we are expressing sense of anger as it happened during the Great March of Freedom, peaceful protest, 2018, 2019, 2020, and we faced with deadly bullets, with explosive bullets, with drones shooting, tear gas. That's what we have been faced with. And on the other level, which is more intensive, that launching war over Gaza as it happened in the past, in the past couple of months, that 11 days of continuous bombardment launched on Gaza, resulting of hundreds of people dying, and families were entirely wiped out of the civil registry in Gaza. And those are the facts that are worthy to be debated, and not the use of violence, because violence started in 1948, and starting with that would resolve much of the problem.
Thank you so much, Issam. You're right, and I guess it goes with the title of your group. We are not just numbers. Your emphasis on humanizing Palestinians sort of coincides with this morning I read, or actually listened to, a podcast from 3 reporters from Haaretz, which I subscribe to, but rarely listen to their podcasts. Olive Ben and 2 others, and they were really seemingly really wonderful people. One of them kept saying that the issue was not, you can't just pour more money on Gaza, from the Gulf, or was resisting the sort of superficial practical approach of, well, we'll just sprinkle some money on the problem. And this young woman, who, by the way, was continually cut off by her male counterparts, kept saying, no, people have an identity and they will not allow that identity to be continually crushed. I'm paraphrasing. But the point is, even she, none of them would utter even the inference of a one democratic state solution. It was, they need their country, so we'll give them a Bantustan someplace, give them a flag, and that'll take care of it. I mean, that was the inference. And it seems to me that none of them, and my brother lives there, so I have some idea of what goes on, do get any humanization of Palestinians, and particularly of Gazans, but it's like Hasbara has become a one-trick pony. All they do is have to say the word Hamas and they're finished. So I thank you for emphasizing and describing the humanity of people in Gaza and Palestinians in general. So what I'm looking for questions in the chat.
Rick, I can help step in here.
Thanks, please do, Ben.
I would say we've got kind of 2 main threads that would be really great to address. Right. One are some of the questions, not only sort of about these efforts and leaders challenging the Palestinian leadership that you all have been critiquing, but also wanting to learn a little more about what some of the movement infrastructure looks like that can keep this going beyond demonstrations. And then the other thread, which I'm happy to repeat later, would be about sort of how folks outside of Palestine can best support grassroots movements in Palestine, including pressuring the US government.
Okay, and forgive me for, everybody has been pretty brief, but these are profound topics. And I know it's difficult because there's just only so much time. But if you could try and keep it to 1 to 2 minutes, each of you, because then we have to close up. We may be able to have some conversation after we close up, but just for right now, let's just take it in the same order. And Ramzy, if you would address what Ben just said, if you could.
Right. So regarding the question of representation and leadership, the problem is not that we do not have leaders. We have an incredible layers of leadership that exist at every level of society. I mean, forget about politics for a second. In terms of education, a few years ago, the teacher of the year, recognized internationally as the best teacher in the world, was a Palestinian. And there's another teacher that is nominated for this year's award. Whatever aspect, whatever field of study, you will always have a Palestinian professor, a poet, an artist, an educationist, and so forth and so on. It's not that our lack of leadership, it's the fact that that leadership is not allowed to emerge, is not allowed the platform to speak out. And because you said, Rick, that we have 1 to 2 minutes, I'm gonna do a little bit of shameless promotion here and say that Ilham Pape and myself are in the process of publishing a book that should appear later this year. So please go ahead and pre-order it, Our Vision for Liberation. Leading engaged Palestinian leaders and intellectuals speak out. Not only that there are 30 top Palestinian leaders in their various fields from Palestine, Israel, and around the world participating in this project, but our friend, comrade Awad Abdelfattah, who is here with us today, is also writing a beautiful essay, or wrote a beautiful essay about his own vision for Palestinians' future. So what we are doing here, we are trying to create our own platforms because we know that we are being shut out as Palestinian intellectuals and leaders and so forth. So we are trying to create our own platforms to speak out, and hopefully such contributions could make a big difference in terms of introducing new voices to the Palestinian discourse. So let me correct that. They are not new voices. These voices have existed for such a long time, but forcing through these voices that have been relegated and marginalized throughout the years.
Thank you so much, Ramzy. And Awad, if you would please also address those issues.
Yeah, the groups, you mean the question was about what kind of groups that are mobilizing, right?
Yeah, are there new formations? Are there new leaders, or are, well,
yeah.
I guess what Ramzy was implying, there are people who are not new, they've been around but are coming to the fore perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, they come to the fore only during the confrontation, the mobilization, when there is a huge uprising like the one we witnessed last May. They would really emerge in the streets, and some of them would also show or appear on media. And we have hundreds of names, hundreds of young thinkers, not only, I mean, field organizers, but really thinkers. So I know hundreds of them inside the Green Line, in the West Bank, and I have been in Gaza for many years, but there are in many of Gaza. Issam is an example of this leadership, and in the exile, in the diaspora, we connect with them through the mail. So I mean, the leaders are being shaped, or the leadership, the new leadership is being shaped now. It's only a matter of time when we see the fruit of this endeavor that is going. It's not stopping. Of course, there always there are sits or ups and downs in the struggle against occupation, but things are continuing. And as I said, there are a lot of obstacles. There are a lot of difficulties. It's not easy. I'm not saying that the reality is beautiful. It is a bleak reality, really. But until recently, people only thought that there was no hope of even unleashing an intifada. And what happened last May proved that really what was being shaped under deep underneath is now has risen to the surface, and we are seeing that. So this is I myself I am optimistic despite this bleak reality, and I'm hopeful that this would come out soon, and we will see more struggles that would and also across the globe. And with regard to what is happening outside, I can't talk about that, but people who are in the exile or in Europe or in the United States can talk better than me what should be done. I know that the problem that we face here, I mean, the division within the national movement also is reflected there among people, and people should unite everywhere. We, at least the grassroots movement, should unite. This is the most important challenge that has to be overcome.
Thank you so much. Issam.
Yeah, if I just want to fulfill my point regarding violence, because I'm seeing several comments in that respect. I don't have much time to answer this, but there is no struggle comes to an end free of costs. Of course, people will be lost and lives will be lost, and we've been doing so for the past 70 years. And before debating the concept of violence, as I said, Israel does not need, just put that into consideration whenever you're thinking about violence, that Israel does not need any reason to kill human beings. They have been doing so before 1948, and it's still going until now. Hamas existed in 1986, and before that, hundreds of massacres were committed. Tens of thousands of people were killed, expelled, forcibly expelled from their original villages. So Hamas is not the main issue here, and limiting the context to Israel and Hamas is just a misdirection and misleading titling of the struggle, because the problem of Israel is Israel itself, not the Israel of Hamas, and not Israel and Hamas. So don't trust me on that. Don't debate the concept of violence, because before arguing Palestinians of what means they're using to liberate themselves, you have to argue why this apartheid system exists until this very moment. And of course, you know, part of the answers, which is the US support of $3.4 billion per year, and the whenever we are attempting to criminalize Israel with the ICC, you know, our attempts are turned to failure, absolute failure, because of the US veto. And there is a lot going on with those answers, but please don't debate what Palestinians are using to respond to this genocide, ongoing genocide.
Thank you, Issam. I think
if I may add to the second question.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
What can you do? What people of the Western communities can do to help the Palestinians? If you are a grassroots organization, if you're somebody who has a connection that you can voice out those Palestinian stories, you have an outlet which is very essential. And this outlet, don't think it's unworthy attempt to voice out Palestinians. It's an important outlet that we have been working on for the past years, and it actually resulted in a great sense that you finally hear our stories. And of course, such an attempt of JVP Los Angeles, you have to put the right people, the right Palestinians, to speak their stories, to share their experiences. This would be the best method of, you know, amplifying the voices of Palestinians.
Great, thank you so much, Issam. Before I forget, what you were saying about violence has a reiteration in a terrific book I know a lot of people on this call probably have read, but if you haven't, I couldn't recommend it too highly. And it is the book called Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom by Norman Finkelstein. And I just happened to be reading it yesterday in a part that sets up the international law that says that an occupying force does not have the right to gratuitously kill people and do what Israel has been doing for decades and decades, but that a people under occupation does have a right under certain circumstances for violent resistance. And he articulates it beautifully. I know it may be of little comfort to those of us when we're faced with the kind of sophistry that we're faced with about, you know, the violent savages right, Ramzy, that besieged the villa in the jungle and so forth, as per your wonderful article, Ramzy. But I think I'm really glad you made that point, Issam, that blaming the victim here is mostly what we get from the media. The missiles, and Hamas, and so forth. So thank you for reiterating that. Mahmoud, any parting thoughts, observations on the huge array of topics of the Palestinian resistance we've been discussing? You're on mute, Mahmoud.
Are muted.
I want to do a personal note, which goes back to the young leadership. In the first Intifada, once again, I was responsible at one point for the printing of one of the declarations, the bayanat. How to do that? I couldn't take it to the Birzeit University because if we were caught, that's it for the Israelis and for the university. And so it took me 2 days to find a typewriter that was not registered by the Israeli authorities so that we can print the bayan. Okay, that was actually, I don't want to say the number, I know the number, is below 10. But a couple of days later, Yasser Arafat in Tunis, and I remember him saying this, he says, I have bayan number 85 in my pocket. What the, that's the kind of situation where we don't want to find ourselves in again. The young leadership of the unified leadership of the uprising then took it upon themselves. They did not wait from outside. They did not wait from, the PLO. They were the ones. And that's the same thing is happening right now. It's the youth, the rank and file of the Palestinian people, so to speak, are the ones who are taking, action. They are the ones who are doing. And so I really have no faith in the standing leadership right now, in the Palestine Authority, and it's the institution as a whole, because it's a creation of Oslo. The Palestine Authority is a creation of Oslo to do the intermediary with a vague kind of mandate. I don't know what. And that's really what we really need to put aside so that we can forge ahead and at least remove one of the obstacles. It's an obstacle right now. And I would once again give, and I'm, from the outside, I want to do respect to the people who are inside, to the people who are struggling, to the people who are getting injured, to the people who are being tear gassed, to the people who are standing against the settlers and their violence, and the soldiers and their violence, and the state and its violence. And I mean, that's what I think about every time I see a news item, is that, the Palestinians are continuing to resist. And I am hopeful that this, the new leadership, the youth who have, as I say, a new vocabulary of struggle, can lead us into a better reality and situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahmoud. Thank you very much. Well, we're getting to the end of the time. We didn't even discuss BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, and its impact, perhaps at a long distance, and maybe, well, we didn't get to discuss it. And it occurs to me that it would be wonderful if we're able to reconvene this group of people at some point soon, because I won't say we did. It would be wrong to say we scratched the surface. We got way, way down below the surface with each of your contributions, all 4 of you. I think I can speak for everybody on this call that, is a breath of fresh air. It's like we're just not exposed to the realities of the Palestinian people's historic resistance, except, what bleeds leads, sensationalist coverage and the like, and the the equalization. Well, the Palestinians did this and the Israelis did that, as if they were equal partners, et cetera. So I really, on behalf of everybody that was able to attend this, want to thank all of you for giving us real insight. And I feel very encouraged because I think intertwined between everything that all of you said, we see the courage of people under huge stress, really unbelievable pressure, that there is still a will, to be free, aside from everything else, from all of the things, including the internal division foisted on them through the PA. There is this indomitable will, and it comes across in everything that you all said. So I want to thank you all very, very much. Ben, I think there was something that we were going to do in the respect of an ask. Could you remind me, beyond what we already talked about of calling Congress?
Yes, absolutely. Well, in addition to contacting your member of Congress to support that new amendment to the National Defense and Authorizations Act, there's always support to be built for HR 2590, which is a historic bill calling for Palestinian human rights. The text of that bill is in the chat, along with a generic call tool to locate your representatives, or a call tool from JVP. And of course, other action items always include visiting We Are Not Numbers, as Issam said, and using your platforms to share stories. We've collected plenty of resources on this call that we'll try to collate for a follow-up email. And there's, of course, always the BDS movement to learn about and support, which has action items and is a great example of committed support to Palestinian liberation.
And if you'll permit me, Dennis, if you feel like it, please put in your email address, since we don't have a website up yet. If people want to contact us and you're still on board, Dennis, could you do that, please? In addition, of course, most of you on this call know, but some may not, that you can go to the JVP website, jvp.org.
And very great, very good.
Somebody was thanking me. I thank you back. I don't know who you were. I'm not really hearing whoever that was, but thank you for your acknowledgement. Jewish Voice for Peace, jvp.org, has a lot of background information. There are other good sources, Electronic Intifada, and the ones of the individuals here. And specifically, if you want to really be up on things, do look up Ramzy Baroud Counterpunch, and you'll find his current article, which is, Ramzy, I've been following you, your writing for years, and I think you outdid yourself. I think this perspective you gave us is wonderful. And as I said to you all, I hope that we could reconvene this group at another time, because there's just so much to cover, and you're all giving us very, very fresh views that we otherwise would not get in this country. And we deeply appreciate you taking the trouble to spend your time with us. And we appreciate the depth of your comments so much. And Mahmoud, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's been a joy.
Rick,
and very nourishing. Yes, Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, this is being recorded, and everybody will have access to the recording once we get it together.
Right. $200 a piece. The operators are waiting for your calls. I wish. So
may
anyway,
I know I want to take
go ahead,
I don't want to put Ramzy on the spot, but I want to put in a word for Palestine Chronicle. is the best source for what's going on in Palestine, and it ties Palestine to the rest of the world. It's not in isolation. Excellent reporting, excellent pieces, editorials, and I have been a long time subscriber. And indeed, the first is on my screen. That's the first thing. I'm just clicking to see what's new. And that's one of the things that I encourage everybody to do. Really is a wonderful source of news and analysis on what's going on in our part of the world.
That's Palestine
Thank you very much.
Chronicles. Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay, so Issam, Awad, Ramzy, Mahmoud, thank you all very, very much. I'm sorry that we have to cut it short because if I didn't have to go to relatives, I might just want to do this all day. But it's really been great. Thank you all so
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Shukran.
Thank
Stay
you.
well
Bye-bye.
and